Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 9, Lecture 4. Most of this lecture is going to be about a problem that keeps expansionary monetary policy from working, and that problem is called the zero-bound problem. But before we get to the zero-bound problem, we do have a question that's left over from last lecture. That question was, sometimes you hear the Federal Reserve Board described as an institution that controls interest rates, and sometimes you'll hear them described as an institution that controls the money supply. So which is it? Does the Federal Reserve Board do monetary policy by moving interest rates or by moving the money supply? Well, let's take a simpler problem first, going back to our old days, back in Module 2, back when you were young, before your dreams were blasted, and talk about hamburgers. So we have a hamburger place, and currently this hamburger place has set their price at $1.20 a hamburger, and they're selling 300 hamburgers a day. And then this hamburger place lowers their price to $1, and their sales rise to 350 hamburgers a day. And then the question is, how do we accurately describe what the hamburger place has done? Have they changed the price of hamburgers, or have they changed the number of hamburgers that they sell? Now here's the demand curve for hamburgers that this place has. So we see that with this demand curve for hamburgers, we can actually describe what is happening either way. It is as accurate to say that the hamburger place has lowered the price from $1.20 to $1 as to say that they have decided to raise the amount they sell from 300 to 350, and then either one implies the other. Because when you have a demand curve, as a business does, right, you're really jointly picking both of the variables and moving from one ordered pair to the other. So whether you describe moving from one point to another point on this demand curve as moving from $1.20 to $1 or 300 hamburgers to selling 350 hamburgers, that's just a convenience. Whatever way is most convenient for you to answer the question that you're trying to ask. Some of you have had micro, and you might have talked about how to understand what a monopoly does, and maybe you even remember that, right, for figuring out what the monopoly is going to do, first you find the quantity by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, and then once you found the quantity from that, you can get the price, so that when you're describing what a monopolist does, it turns out it's more convenient to talk about how many they want to sell rather than the price. And this is true even if this hamburger place had a meeting to discuss what to do, and the whole meeting was using the terminology of what should we set our price at. And ultimately there's a vote and they decide to move the price from $1.20 to $1. And maybe they never say, and we're going to go from selling 300 to 350 hamburgers. Can I still describe what they have chosen to do as choosing to go from selling 300 to 350? The answer is yes, totally, if that's what is most convenient for me. Because choosing the price and the quantity are not separate decisions to be analyzed separately. To do one thing means to decide to do the other, whether you explicitly note that or not. So what does this mean about understanding if the Federal Reserve Board is choosing to change the money supply or choosing to change interest rates? Well, there is a demand curve for money. We talked about this earlier. And here we see the demand curve based on the idea that with higher interest rates, people want less cash in the cookie jar and more bonds in the cookie jar, that the higher the interest rates are, the less money people want to hold. So let's say that the Federal Reserve Board has created $3 trillion and that the current interest rates are 5%. And now the Fed orders banks to lower interest rates to 4%. Will that work? And the answer is without changing the money supply, it won't. Because here's the problem. At the lower interest rate, people want more money in the cookie jar. If the Fed doesn't create more money, then how are people going to get more money in the cookie jar? Well, one way to get more money that you can store is to spend less. In other words, the stores will lose customers and there'll be a recession unless the Federal Reserve Board backs up or supports their lowering of interest rates by creating the additional money that people want to hold at the lower interest rate. The other thing I'll note is, based on our discussion of the credit market in previous lectures, you understand that if the Fed just told banks to lower interest but did not create more money for the banks to have to lend, that would just create a shortage of loanable funds, and the interest rate would rise back up. So both by the way the credit market works and the money market works, and the money market here, you might have heard the term money market to describe a particular kind of investment. That's not this. This is actually meaning the market to have money, to have cash in the cookie jar. That if the Fed wants a lower interest rate to work, they have to support that lower interest rate with the additional money that people will want at the lower interest rate. Because if the Fed doesn't create additional money when people want additional money, it causes a recession because they try to get that additional money by spending less and thus having money for the cookie jar. This is why when we had the Y2K panic back in 2000, which I'm afraid most of you are too young to remember, but there was great fear that when we moved from 1999 to 2000, that computers, which way back then the primitive machines we had were actually storing the year with only the last two digits. You know how frequently you'll write, it's September 7th, 2020 as 9720. Computers back then did that. They stored the year as only the last two digits, which meant people were worried that when the bank computers hit January 1st, 2000, and the computer would think that the 00 meant 1900, and and bad things would happen. All the bank computers would crash, the ATMs wouldn't work, and so people wanted to have a lot of cash in their cookie jar on January 1st, 2000. And if the Fed did nothing, all this extra demand for cash, where would they get the cash, right? They would either stop spending at the store to build up cash, which would mean stores lost customers, drop in aggregate demand, go into a recession, or the banks would lose the cash, and then there'd be a credit shortage and the interest rates would rise. If the Fed didn't want those things to happen, they had to create the additional cash for people to put in their cookie jar, which is what they did. There was a significant increase in the money supply leading up to January 2000. And then once it came and nothing happened, people didn't want the cash anymore, then the Fed lowers the money supply back down. So same thing here. If they're going to lower the interest rate so people want more money, they better create that more money, or people will get more money by not buying as much, and the stores lose customers, aggregate demand goes to the left, throws us into recession. So what we're seeing is that the decision to lower interest rates from 5% to 4% then carries with it, to make that work, the decision to increase the money supply from 3 trillion to 3.6 trillion to support the extra 0.6 trillion people want in the cookie jar at the lower interest, in exactly the same way that the decision to lower the price of hamburgers from $1.20 to $1 carried with it the implication we have to create the extra hamburgers that people will want to buy. So do we describe what the Fed is doing by lowering the interest rate as deciding to lower the interest rate from 5 to 4%? Or do we describe what the Fed is doing by saying the Fed has decided to increase the money supply from 3 trillion to 3.6 trillion? And the answer is the same as the hamburger problem. Whatever is most convenient for understanding the problem you're trying to understand is the right way to do it. The decision to lower the interest rate by the Fed means also a decision to increase the money supply. And the decision to increase the money supply means that the interest rate will go down, the banks will have more to lend and drive down the interest rate. So this slide is saying what I just said. And what's pointed out here is the Fed in their minutes may only be talking about should we lower the interest rate from 5 to 4%. You'll hear that argument. People will say, well, the Fed makes policy by setting the interest rate because if you look at their minutes of the meeting, they may have decided to lower the interest rate and didn't say anything about the money supply. But that's a superficial understanding because the decision to lower the interest rate has built into it the decision to increase the money supply to support the lower interest rate. Just like it's a superficial understanding to say, well, the hamburger place didn't decide to sell more hamburgers, they just decided to lower their price. Yeah, but if you decide to lower your price, you're going to be selling more hamburgers. It's built into the cake. All right, now we're ready to talk about the zero-bound problem. Zero-bound problem is actually a rather recent term used to describe this. Back in the old days, Keynes talked about this a little bit. In the Depression, he called it the liquidity trap. But nowadays, us hip economists call it the zero-bound problem. See, the usual way that monetary policy works, expansionary monetary policy, is the Fed creates bank reserves. The banks lower the interest rate because they have more money to lend, so there's a surplus in the credit market. And then people borrow the new money and then they spend it. Thus an increase in buying. But what if, as the Fed creates more bank reserves, the interest rate's already down to zero? Then the banks really have no incentive to loan out the extra reserves. By loaning it out, you're just risking losing it. You're not really getting anything because the interest rate's so close to zero, it's not a profitable thing. In fact, it's worse than that because banks do have the option of storing their reserves on deposit with the Fed, and the Fed pays interest. This is a very small amount of interest, 0.25%, but it's still positive. So when the interest rate on loans to customers gets close to 0%, the bank says, should we loan out at a low interest rate close to zero to someone who may not pay back, or should we just take the reserves and put it on deposit at the Fed and get the safe and sure 0.25%? They choose to do that. To continue this discussion, I have to give you a new term. It's called the monetary base. The monetary base is currency, all currency. Remember, the money supply is always only currency outside of banks. But the monetary base is currency inside and outside of banks. So basically, it's all the currency that the U.S. government has created. Some of this currency not being money. So you see the monetary base is not the same thing as money. Just because you're monetary base, you could be money if you're cash outside banks, but not if you're cash inside banks. And then plus the bank deposits at the Fed. That is the monetary base. The Fed doesn't actually control the money supply. The Fed controls the monetary base. Normally, that's a distinction without too much difference because the Fed can increase the monetary base, which is bank deposits at the Fed or cash reserves in the vault by doing open market operations, buying government securities from the banks. And then the banks get the cash into their vault. It's not money yet. It's monetary base, but then they loan it out and it becomes money. So by increasing the monetary base, the Fed then increases bank reserves that banks loan out, and the money supply goes up. But when you hit the zero bound problem, it may not work that way. For example, from 2008 to 2014, the Fed increased the monetary base from $800 billion to $4,000 billion. That's an increase of 500%. That seems pretty big. Is that pretty big? Yeah, that's huge. And why is the Fed doing that? Because they're trying to use expansionary monetary policy to end that Great Recession of 2009, 2010, which we see coming and starting in 2008. So the Fed is trying to get a significant increase in the money supply so people have more money to buy things, and aggregate demand moves to the right, and voila, we're out of the recessionary gap. So basically, they increase the amount, you can think of it sort of, they increase the amount of currency they're printing up by 500%. During that same time, M2, the money supply measurement M2, rose from 8,000 billion to 11,000 billion. That's an increase of 37.5%, which is about an increase of 6.25% a year. And that's a very ordinary number. Money supply goes up sometimes 6.25% when the Fed's not doing anything special to try to give a big increase to the money supply. So we have an economic puzzle here, a conundrum. Riddle me this, Batman. How can the monetary base go up 500%, and yet the money supply only go up 37.5%? And the answer is the zero bound problem. Now let's look at excess reserves held by banks. Remember what excess reserves? Excess reserves are the amount of money in bank vaults or in deposit at the Fed above and beyond what the banks have to legally hold. Excess reserves rose from 1.876 billion to 2,677 billion. That's not a typo on my part. It went from less than 2 to 2,600. That's a crazy increase, and that's a zero bound problem. The Fed was creating cash like crazy and through open market operations, getting it into bank vaults with the hopes the banks would lend it out. But the banks said, why would we lend it out? The interest rate's close to zero. Not going to make any money off it. Not going to make any more than if we just shovel it back into our deposit at the Fed and get the small but sure interest rate on bank deposits at the Fed. So as fast as the Fed was trying to shovel money into the economy, the banks were shoveling it out again right back to the Fed. Normally, of course, they would have loaned those new reserves to businesses and customers, but with interest rates almost at zero, there was no benefit to doing so. Better to be safe and shovel it back and store it at the Fed. Now, if interest rates could in any case, unless interest rates fell, people wouldn't want to borrow the money, but interest rates can't fall below zero. That's the zero bound. Interest rates can't go below zero, and so they can't fall below zero to get more people to want to borrow the money. Now, if businesses had confidence in the future, they would be willing to borrow at higher than 0% interest in order to build new factories, but they don't have confidence in the future. So they're not willing to pay high enough interest to make it worthwhile for the banks to lend. So here we are stuck in a bad economy. So to repeat, that's called the zero bound problem because that's referring to the difficulty for the Fed of creating additional money when interest rates are really close to zero. So banks see no reason to loan out any reserves that the Fed creates through open market operations. So what can we do about this? Well, two things. One is fiscal policy, but there's another thing we can do that's still monetary policy. But before we learn that, we have to learn one of the two most famous equations in macroeconomics. You know one already, GDP equals C plus I plus G. Next lecture, you'll learn the other of the two famous macroeconomic equations. So I know you'll be coming back quickly to hear that. But right now you need to do your textbook reading and take quiz 2, and I will see you after that. Until then, take care.